All right. If everyone's ready, we'll begin. So hello and welcome everyone to SIB-Groningen, the Dutch United Nations Student Association. You can already see what the lecture is about over here. You've probably read the event description on our website, so I don't have to do a very long and lengthy description of what we do or of who our speakers are. But I'll still just give you a short overview of who'll be speaking first. So the format of this lecture, as I already said before we start live streaming, is that we'll be first joined by Dr. Espen Stoknes. He's a Norwegian psychologist with a PhD in economics. Dr. Stoknes is on the European Commission's board for climate adaptation. And he'll be sharing a bit about, his work in general, about his background, his career, and most importantly, about how we can adapt to new conditions in order to thrive in a different climate. So without further ado, let me hand over the word to Espen Stoknes. If you have any questions, please send them to me, and I will select you during the Q&A after he is finished. So please, a round of applause, virtual applause for Dr. Stoknes.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Pleasure joining the Groningen SIB. And my plan was to invite you for a trip in the Norwegian mountains this evening. And unfortunately, it's dark and wet and not so easy. But you can see this is from outside of Oslo, about an hour's drive, where I have a small cabin. But actually, I'm sitting in my boring home office with a bookshelf just behind me. So climate adaptation has a lot to do with how engaged people are and when it comes to climate change, whether they see it as a personal issue or whether they prefer to disengage. So what I thought I would do was to give a short recap, but a tailored version of my TED talk on this topic, how it relates to the Dutch situation right now, and also how I hope Groningen can improve and help improve the engagement with the climate issue, both mitigation and adaptation in the coming year. So I gave this talk back in 2017, very soon 3 years, and a lot has happened since then. What I did do then was to give an overview of the current state of psychological and social science knowledge on how people respond to climate change. I didn't speak about climate change, I spoke about the science of science communication, or if you will, research on how the brain responds when it counters powerful or abstract scientific messages that has personal relevance. So just after that, 2017, we had in the Northern Hemisphere what some people dubbed the summer from hell. It was the driest, warmest summer in the Northern Hemisphere for about 150 years. It was wildfires and droughts in most of the European countries, particularly Portugal, Spain, and even Sweden and cool, rainy Norway had wildfires. And we've had accumulated evidence, 18 of the 19 hottest years, all since 2000. Also, just after this summer, into the autumn of 2018, came two important news pieces. One was an article by Johan Rockström, William Steffen, and more, which was called Towards a Hothouse Earth, which got probably the most attention for a climate peer-reviewed scientific article for many, many years. Also, IPCC released their special report on 1.5 degree warming just after that summer, and it got also extraordinary amounts of attention, and it draws up the main differences between achieving a 1.5 degree warmer world and a 2 degree warmer world, which is that relative to the 1.5 degree warmer world, there will be even more summers like the 2018, more heat waves. There will be less fresh water in those areas that are prone to droughts, and similarly more floods, and we will lose all the corals in the oceans if we head towards 2 degrees rather than 1.5. Right after this also came the IPBES report, which is the report on biodiversity and ecosystems. And the debate was summed up by one researcher, one journalist in this picture, with a picture of this albatross with the plastic. Everything is fucked. Major new extinction report finds. And there was the insectocalypse with the bees, and they concluded that 1 million species are at risk for extinction. And even these penguins agree that humans are to blame. So how do people respond? Well, there was also this brutal news that 2018 had the highest emissions ever, and emissions for 2019 have the same level. And into this stepped Greta Thunberg with Fridays for Future. And it was a very interesting time for me as a climate psychologist to study how the public perception and the public attitudes and the agenda shifted with this wave, which lasted all the way up to COVID. Before that became the predominant concern. So what do we know from big surveys and studies? There is something called the Eurobarometer, which does field work on this every second year approximately. And all a representative population, select representatives, selected part of the population is asked the question, how serious a problem do you think global warming / climate change is at this moment on a scale from 1 to 10? So you can answer that for yourself. And then they've been showing what larger percentage of the population saying it's very serious, which means 7 to 10 on this scale. And if we look back to 2008, all the way to 2019, because that's the latest data we have, after this summer of heat and the start of the school strikes, then the country of Finland, for instance, back in 2008, there was a very high level of concern. But then the financial crisis struck, and we had also the failed Copenhagen conference. And then we had the Paris conference over here. So there's been this dip, but happily rising. But Finland is still not as high as it was back in 2008. Sweden started a bit lower and ended the concern even higher. Germany, similar. And this is the EU 27 average over this period. So also ended higher in concern in 2019 than ever before. Netherlands, however, not quite the same picture, but some of the same dynamics, even though a little bit lower. So the reason for this, well, I'll leave that for you guys to find out why Netherlands is down there. But it's not that much lower than Finland, just a bit lower than the EU average. Also, the question was asked, which of the following do you consider to be the single most serious problem facing the world as a whole? And blue here is poverty, green is terrorism, yellow is climate change, and red is the economic situation. So in 2011, poverty, climate change, and economic situation. Then after the financial crisis, the economic situation along with poverty. And in 2019, again, climate change is the second highest, with 25% or 24% of the population ranking it as number one serious problem facing the world as a whole. Finland, however, is up there. Denmark is on the 47, and Sweden is up on the 50%. So there are huge differences inside all these. So, okay, that was some numbers. I want to spend most of my time on discussing the psychology of this. So after looking at how this very powerful news and this very powerful movement, the Fridays for Future, and the rising visibility of the public about climate change again, how do we get people engaged in solving global warming? Because one thing is concern, and another thing is taking action on it. And a lot of people struggle with this because global warming is such a big, strange, abstract, threatening issue that for many people, it's better to tune out. And I've been, for the years, studying how the brain responds, as I mentioned, and I reviewed about 300 to 400 peer-reviewed articles before I wrote my book, which was called What We Think About, and We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. In this book, I sum it up as the biggest barrier to solving climate change challenge is about 15 centimeters thick. It's the space between our ears. So we have 5 major inner defenses that come up inside when the climate news, so to speak, hits us. The first, when there's some kind of climate news, just like the one I said, maybe that never been higher emissions than in 2018. We've triggered some tipping points towards a hothouse Earth. We are above 415 ppms of CO2 in the atmosphere. All these are typical climate news items. And the first barrier that usually comes up is a distance barrier, or more specifically, the psychological distance barrier, because climate change is usually described as something happening in the future. It will get worse in 2030, 2050, 2100. So it's not here and it's not now. Also, it's described as happening in the Arctic ice, the glaciers are melting, or it's a cyclone in the Pacific. All these things are very far away from us. So what the brain hears that it's not here, it's not now. Also, it hears that it's a very big problem. It's outside what I can do anything about. So it's outside my circle of influence, which means that I will lower my level of concern for it because I can't do anything about it anyway. We often prefer to fill our attention on neighbor issues, personal, what I'm going to do this weekend, what I said to my boss today, or what my friend said yesterday. These are the issues that typically go around in our brains. We do have problems with very abstract, long-term, non-local or global level issues. If we do get the feeling and the message across that climate change is here, it's happening now, then the next barrier that comes up is often one of doom, which is that all this news is very threatening. It's a looming disaster. And when you keep hearing that over and over again, we gradually get desensitized. We get numb. And then we also start to avoid the issue because it generates uncomfortable feelings in me, some maybe shame, some guilt. And finally, it's easy to kind of push back on the people who are coming with the message. So we take the messenger rather than the issue, or we kick the man rather than the ball. Or in the latest years, many have taken to kicking the girl, or Greta, rather than going into the issue. So a lot of news and a lot of communications feed this story of apocalypse, and gradually we automatize our response to turn attention somewhere else. But if you manage to kind of get over the doom barrier by saying that, you know, there are things we can do about this, we have the solutions, we can implement them, then the next barrier comes up, which is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a word that psychologists use for a situation where you both know something and you don't know something at the same time. You know something and then you do something that is conflicting with what you know. So when your knowledge and action doesn't really mix. For instance, if I know that I have high emissions, I contribute to that by the way I live and what I eat. And I also know that CO2 leads to climate chaos. Then this dissonance becomes like a black, uncomfortable feeling. And the brain immediately wants to get that away. We want to feel well about ourselves. So I could easily say to myself that my emissions are really quite small. or it's not me, it's my neighbor, or it's not me, it's my colleague, or it's not the Netherlands or Norway, it's the UK or the US. And the US people, they can say, well, it's the Chinese. So we can always point somewhere else. It's them, not me. That's a automatic way the brain do self-justifications to get away from the dissonance. And also I can change the importance of one. I could say, for instance, that, climate is always changing. And it's been changing for thousands of years. And that creates a demand for these kind of messages that create doubt. So if I really can believe that it's cosmic radiation or it's the sun flare or whatever, then I don't have to feel the dissonance anymore, because CO2 doesn't lead to climate chaos. I can also put something additional up. For instance, I've installed solar panels on my roof now, so my trip to Thailand doesn't really matter. Also, we could do it on a social level. Like, for instance, DiCaprio, when he said climate change is the most important issue that humanity is facing at the Oscar, and made a big deal about it. The day afterwards, some people on the web like to point out how he's dissonant. So this is my car, this is my house, this is my other house, this is my yacht. And this way we could discredit those people who take action because they are not for real. So we solve the dissonance by projecting it on somebody else. Fourth, if I automatize all those things, I distance, I avoid the doom, I don't really want, I do self-justifications, and then this happens by itself, then I will no longer notice, or I don't really remember the climate news or the climate situation, and then I can live on as if I don't really know what I know. So I'll be living a double life, both knowing and not knowing. And finally, there's the identity issue, which is that a lot of people in Western cultures have identity, for instance, that go with freedom, individual freedom, and market freedom. And if I hear from some kind of climate activist that what we need is more regulation, we need more taxes, the government needs to step up, then surely that must be the wrong advice. Hence, the climate science must be wrong too, because they come at the wrong conclusion. So that's often why we often see that people with free market ideology, free market thinking, conservative values, often they resist taking in climate facts and prefer to find other news to listen to, such as misinformation, and then hit back on people who try to criticize their lifestyle, criticize their meat, their cars, their flights. This is very important for who I am and or their oil jobs, so I will keep doing it. So these are the 5 barriers: distance, doom, dissonance, denial, and identity. And to a large extent, they actually then explain why it's hard for people to take action, and why, for instance, that we saw a declining concern over a lot of the years since 2008, even though the climate situation just keeps getting worse. So this psychological climate paradox, that the more we know, the less concern, because we put up the barriers rather than engaging. So enough about the barriers. What do we know that actually works then if you want to create engagement in climate, both climate mitigation and adaptation? Those are really 2 sides of the same coin. So what we need to do is to get over the distance barrier by making climate more social. We are social animals as humans. We always look at what other people are saying or doing. We compare ourselves with others, and we get by through relationships, and a lot of our quality of life is dependent on how we relate to people that we perceive as important, my peers. So, for instance, if my peers or my neighbors get solar panels, then I want one too. So we know from studies that solar panels on roofs tops, they are quite contagious. They spread like a virus. So you could even use epidemiological formulas from how virus spreads to predict the likelihood of other houses getting solar panels. If 1 or 2 in the neighborhood has one, then it really spreads. I was interested in this research, and I asked 2 psychologists in Norway at the University of Oslo that I was supervising if they could map how the purchases of electric cars, EVs, were spreading in Oslo. As you may know, EVs is a big thing in Norway, and particularly Oslo. Whether then it was kind of random if somebody bought a car, or was it a pattern in the sense that if somebody got an electric car, would then the neighbor houses also get electric cars? So they plotted 18,000 electric vehicles sales to the addresses within 18 months to see if there was a statistically significant, more frequent neighborhood or peer sales rather than random. So random, it was gray. This is the city of Oslo. And these red ones show a very strong, significant, statistically significant frequency of there's one electric car and the next one. And the blues were quite a bit surprising for me, but very funny, because these are streets that are significantly low. So there's nobody here who buys an electric car, then nobody else would buy one either. We don't have that here. We don't really like electric cars. It's a stupid thing. So we quickly could see how these social norms spread in a contagious way. So we should use this tool to create engagement, speak about what we do, speak about how we eat, and we just do it. We don't preach, we just do it, and people can see what we're doing, and then it will spread like rings in the water of the social norms. It really works. Another thing is to switch climate communication into a more supportive framings, which means that we shouldn't ignore in any way the existential climate threat, but for each threat, we should add 3 supportive or positive solutions and possibilities to take action. So for instance, after speaking about the climate, we could speak about how switching to plant-based protein, plant-based burgers, such as this one, delicious red with red beet, etc., juices and gastronomic innovations can help us eat and live better lives with much less footprint. So that's just one solution. We should also speak about how the renewable energies are creating so many new jobs, many more than we are losing in the fossil sector. So now it's about 12 million jobs, and each day we install more than 1 million solar panels somewhere. So by the time you get to bed tonight, the world has had 1 million more solar panels in one day. So imagine that. It's really incredible how this is moving along right now, and it's changing the energy system around. So what I'm doing now is to give more supportive framings, and I'm trying to balance the threats to a 3-to-1. It's called the positivity ratio. The next step would be to fix the dissonance, and there we can make it more simple for people to take climate-friendly behaviors. So it's called nudging often, or behavioral economics. If you guide somebody, give them a little nudge, then it's much easier to switch to a climate-friendly behavior. And when the behavior is friendly, then it is more aligned with my thinking, and the dissonance goes down. So for instance, if I'm at a buffet and there's a big plate like this one, this is maybe what I eat for lunch, but it looks kind of empty. So the big plate, I would fill it up with more stuff, but then that becomes food waste. So they tried first changing people's patterns by saying a sign, please don't take more food than you need. And it was hardly any response. Then they gave people smaller plates like this one, where you can see how the food, it's the same food, perfectly fits on this plate. It looks full. So people stopped piling on more food here, and suddenly now the food waste went down with 20%. And if you know a bit about how climate intensive it is to make food, then you also know what a big gain it is if we can cut food waste with 20%. So that's a little nudge, but there are hundreds of these nudges, both within food and mobility and clothes. So we should really employ so-called green nudging. And if you're interested, Google it. You'll find a lot of stuff on green nudges. Next barrier is the denial, which is our tendency to forget. We don't really want to think about it. And if we can get, however, a positive signal back that we're actually moving in our right direction, not just a whole climate system. I'm thinking about the ppms in the atmosphere or the average temperature rise per century, but rather what are we doing? What is he doing? What is that company doing? How is our city doing? If we get these kind of personalized feedback, then the motivation goes up and the denial kind of falls away. So we need to flip denial by giving people feedback on how well they're doing. And one app that could be done to use that is called Ducky. You can click what you did today or yesterday, and then it calculates how much this adds up to. So you could have the whole SIB or another student organization, one of those you mentioned, and you could compete to see who are, as a sum, doing the most over time. So you could also pit different cities. So Groningen against Utrecht or whatever city you want to compete with. This is a way to add it up, and it helps people get motivated. Finally, there is the identity issue. The identity barrier, which is really best overcome by better storytelling, particularly stories about the future we want to create, and not just the story about how the world is going to hell. So we should use the brain really loves stories, and we should then use that power to create in our minds. We should imagine a world that we want to live in, and we should speak about that world, and we should also speak about the people doing things today in order to make it come real, to inspire others to join. So for instance, one friend and a lady is called Christina Bu. This is her. She's heads the Norwegian Electric Car Association, and at the beginning she was ridiculed because electric cars are just stupid and their batteries come from Congo and blah 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 blah, and they're more polluting than fossil cars. So she took a lot of critique, but she stood up, and eventually the whole country now has shifted. So we now are selling 60% electric cars, and the fossil fuel cars are plumbing, and hopefully we will have sold the last fossil fuel car in Norway by 2025. So she took a lot of criticism, but now she's asked to come all over the world to speak about how Norway, and I also know it's happening quickly in the Netherlands now, luckily, is changing to electric mobility. Not just cars, but also buses, bikes, and ferries and ships are going electric. So if then somebody with an electric car, an electric bike comes home and tells that to their neighbor or their friends, how they're enjoying this electric bus and electric whatever, mobility or the new burger, these are stories that help change the mindset. We can imagine a better future. We can share stories about both personal and societal stories, and that also brings on our friends and peers again. So we come full circle back to social. So these 5 solutions are much more brain friendly. If we do things social, simple, supportive, and give people signals and have a story that gives us a shared, unified direction, then we know that humans can actually take action for the long term, even though the climate threat is abstract and difficult to deal with today. So with that, I will stop my share and we'll go back into Q&A mode, I think. That was 25 minutes or so, wasn't it?
Yeah, perfect. Exactly. Yeah, well timed. All right. Thank you for that lecture. Quite an interesting perspective. Not really one I'd really considered in depth before. But yeah, now we just leave it over to the audience. If anyone has their questions, feel free to raise your hand. How you do this is you go to the participants button on the bottom left, and then there should be a button which says raise hand on the right. If you can't raise your hand, you can also just send me a message or use the thumbs up or thumbs down. All right, we have a question from our treasurer or president already.
Question from the president.
What we were wondering, or what I was wondering, is that there's currently a court case in the EU against calling fake meat products actual meat, like, I don't know, soy-based burgers that they're not allowed to call meat. What do you think? What kind of influence will that have on the consumption of these products? And do you think that that's a dangerous thing or a good thing? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's the meat industry suing somebody else to calling their products meat, huh? I hope they lose. So I think anybody who makes food should be free to call it in an authentic way. I mean, they shouldn't pretend it's meat, so it should be properly labeled that it's plant-based. But if it's plant-based meat, then it's plant-based meat. But I know some companies, for instance, Corn or Oomph, they are consciously not calling it meat because they feel, from a marketing point of view, that this is a new avenue and they don't really want people to compare it with meat. So even though I think the meat lobby should lose on this issue, I'm not sure it makes a lot of difference, because if you really get a brand like Oatly or Oomph or Corn, then these brands can become competitive and outcompete the meat industry even then. So I think both approaches are needed and important. I also like, for instance, what Impossible Foods are doing with their Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger. So they're not calling it meat, and yet they are succeeding like mad, and they're making the meat industry very afraid, which is very good news. And for instance, when the Beyond Meat went to the stock exchange in New York last year, I think they started with a price of about $30 per share, and then it surged to about 150, which is a 5-time doubling, and much better performance than their major competitor, which is Tyson Meat. Tyson Meat is one of the biggest stock-listed meat companies in the world. And Tyson Meat was very afraid when they saw that because they felt they could lose market share. And then what did they do? Well, they actually started selling plant-based burgers themselves. So in this way, just like Tesla has been beating up the car industry, the offensive and the very clever, innovative plant-based protein companies have been scaring the shit out of the meat industry, and many of these are gaining market shares, and meat consumption in the rich world is actually going down. So I think we're winning. So even though the meat industry tries to sue, they're on the losing front, and it doesn't make me sad at all.
Right.
I don't know.
It's quite a
that was
positive outlook. Yeah, I hope that answered your question, Madam President. We now have a question from Anouk.
Yes. Anouk, yeah. And then there's a question in the chat as well. Yeah.
The president from Utrecht. Hi, next president.
Oh, another president. Oh, so many presidents there. I'm really nervous now. Yes?
Maybe linked to the previous question, but then taking into consideration the percentage of people from the countries that you mentioned, the percentage of people that think that climate change is an issue. How far do you think we are away to having no meat in supermarkets?
No meat in supermarkets?
Yeah, that everything is plant-based.
Yeah. I think we're very far away from that. That's my honest perception. So even though I would love to see that myself, I doubt that will happen, at least in my lifetime. And I will probably live to 2050, but maybe you will live even further and see to live that day. I'm certainly joining that fight to ban meat but those are very deep. And when you speak about, I told you about these barriers, and the deepest and the innermost barrier is identity. And a lot of identity is connected to what we eat. So we have national meals, and Sweden, they have köttbullar, which is meatballs. And if you go to IKEA, you'll get them. And I think a lot of Swedes would rather die than not be able to get their meatballs. And also Norwegians are very fond of eating, let's say, sheep or mutton for Christmas. So it's a tradition that goes back since before almost modern times, way back into medieval times. And it's deeply ingrained in the culture and identity. And I hope as many as possible will shift away from that. But these things go very slowly. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, Anouk, but I do support the goal. But from a psychology and cultural point of view, I think it will go very slowly. However, it can go quickly enough to save the climate, because we don't have to ban. We just have to at least half the consumption of meat in order to be able to deliver on the 2-degree target. So if we could halve meat consumption in the coming decades, that would take us a very long way. So we just need to get the meat consumption sinking every year. That would be put us on a path to a more sustainable Earth. So let's say 5% per year, then it would every 15 years it would go to half. So 4-5-6% reduction in meat consumption per year. That's a really big deal, and I would be very happy if we could achieve that. But you can push me, Anouk, if you want to. Do you think I'm wrong?
I think maybe in our generation, I'd say, that's maybe linking to the social aspect that you mentioned. I think for us, it's really a big thing for us to be conscious about your decisions that you make and making a green choice. Maybe for us, our luxury product would be not meat, but the substitute for that.
I support that, Anouk. I'm what I'm called a reducitarian. I eat less and less meat, and only when I get it served by family or in traditional situations, etc. So I try to ask for vegetarian options always, but I know, at least in Norway, as I said, people would rather die than give up their meat. I'm sorry.
I think you'll find much the same situation here. If I look at my fellow students in the city, it's always maybe 1 and 2 still eating meat, at least in my circles. I hope that answered your question, Anouk. In that case, we'll move on to Carla's question in the chat, followed by Dr. Groeskamp's, after which we'll end this Q&A. So Carla asked, how can we bring climate change back to the main agenda in an uncertain, struggling world of COVID-19?
Exactly. Well, the easy answer is get a vaccination. We need a vaccine. But I also think that gradually, in the same way as I talked about habituation for the climate threat, we also get habituated to COVID. So after living with it for some time, we'll get used to it, even if it doesn't disappear completely, because humans are very good at habituating to all kinds of weird things. We can live very far up in the mountains and very cold, and we can live in the ice like the Inuits, or we can live in the desert. And gradually we get habituated and used to stuff. And even if we don't get a perfect vaccine, eventually COVID will kind of slide back in becoming one of many diseases, and it doesn't bring down society anymore. I would guess that would take more like 6 to 9 months more of this, and then people would get used to it and living with it in the same way we live with other dangerous diseases, whether it's sexually transmitted disease or cancer or other issues. But more than that, I think we should also learn from COVID. And there are a number of commonalities and similarities between how people respond. Because just like in February this year, people were seeing COVID as something very distant. Oh, it was something happening in China, just Wuhan. And then people were talking about, oh, it can become a pandemic. Oh, don't start with this disaster talk. And then in the beginning, people were reluctant to follow government regulations. They were buying lots of toilet paper and all kinds of weird shopping habits, doing dissonant, non-logical things. And so then suddenly it changed. Suddenly COVID became something near, no longer distant. It was a doom that we actually, or a threat that we actually took in, and we changed. And we're starting hand washing and wearing masks, etc. We were starting to behave aligned with what we know, and social distancing in particular. So some of the important changes, how quickly society changed when we took suddenly, everybody realized that COVID was something real, and the barriers fell away. Then we also learned that ignorance about science can be fatal. And when it comes to complex issues, we really need to listen to experts. We really need to follow the scientific advice. And we also learned, I have learned, that leaders that belittle and neglect science make both COVID and climate much harder to tackle. And also the science literacy, people suddenly started to understand the R factor and exponential growth in a new way. So I don't want, society to change through disaster. I prefer to change through design. And I think the response that we had for COVID can give us a lot of inspiration to see how quickly we can change society if and when we take the threat seriously. And actually, I think the pandemic can help solutions as well, such as renewables and digital communications. So as interest rates now are falling, then renewable energy becomes much cheaper relative to fossil fuels. And investments in fossils are now seen as very risky. And that stops investments in renewables. Sorry, it stops investments in fossils, but investments in renewables keep going up. So this is actually an opportunity for sustainable energy to get a head start and starting to accelerate away from fossil energies. So those were a few reflections on how we can learn from the COVID crisis to tackle climate better.
All right. I mean, not only with it getting cheaper to invest in green energy, but I imagine also if they stop subsidizing not green energy, it would already cause a great change. Now I would like to, for a final question, I'd like to allow Dr. Groeskamp to ask this question. Dr. Groeskamp is our other speaker for today. He will be shortly giving the second part to the symposium. So before we move on to his part of the symposium, Dr. Groeskamp, your question, please.
Yeah, Per, thank you for your talk. You were saying so many things that I love to hear, really. I had a lot of questions, but I'll try and keep it short. First of all, I hope that the not eating meat will spread like a virus as well. Also, but the parallels between Corona and climate change, for example, as a climate scientist, I've seen a lot of those parallels. And in fact, there was this nice cartoon that was looking at a bunch of Corona scientists that were talking to each other and saying, oh, we can reason with the people because, Corona is here. And then you saw a bunch of climate scientists next to it laughing, thinking, oh, you need much more than that, And it was all very, I recognized a lot of that. But one of my questions was, you showed these 5 compartments. Do people have to go through all 5 of them before a change can occur, really? And if so, where do you think Trump is in this spectrum? Because he's clearly in denial, but to be in denial, he would have had to go through 1, 2, and 3 first, which means he's almost there. So I was wondering if you had some thoughts about this.
Very good question. No, I don't think, even though they look very systematic on my diagram, they are somewhat more, shall we say, not necessarily connected, and it's not like stages. It's more like different kinds of barriers that would pop up due to the communication situation and also the cultural background. So for instance, in Norway, everybody here acknowledges that we do have global warming and that it is a real issue. But Norwegians, and particularly because we have oil, come with a lot of dissonance. So they prefer to say, well, no, the world is going to need clean energy, and we provide oil and gas to Europe much cleaner than other people do, like Russia or Exxon. So it's a way of doing self-justification of the dissonance that Norwegians are in. We know about the climate, but we continue producing oil. So Norwegians have this very broad, very diffused, very prevalent dissonance. While in the US, also I'm basing this on some sociological research. There's a fantastic article, a classic one by Dunlop and also his other name, called The White Cool Dudes. In this Anglo-Saxon culture, the emphasis on free market values and the small government, avoiding having the state regulate too much. So these deep conservative values easily set up the identity barrier as the main, I would say, the main strongest force. Trump, I even said this in my TED talk, I think, Trump, identity trumps truth every day. So Trump pushes an image of who he wants to be, and that's the only thing that he cares about is the self-promotion of his own values and his own value system. And in that, he reached about 40% of the American population. The 60 other percent are alarmed. So in the US, I would say identity is the main barrier, and denial is even a bit in service of that. So even now, a majority of Americans know that climate is a major global threat, and they would like the government to do something about it. But still, their dominant conservative values make them reluctant for their identity makes it reluctant to let go and have the government actually implement the carbon taxes and the regulations that are needed. So in short, happily, everyone doesn't have to go through the 5 barriers. They are established according to international research. And also, if you manage to get 1 or 2 of them, bypass them by the solutions, making it social, simple, supportive storytelling and signals, then you don't have to all 5 either. Sometimes it helps with 2 or 3, and then suddenly people get engaged. So it's a little bit more flexible than the fortress system.
Yep. Thanks. Great answer. And a very quick one. When you guys were mentioning Corona, in the beginning, we saw there was a lot of, people really accepted the fact that Corona was here, and everybody suddenly was willing to do anything to avoid it. Then Corona, the regulations were smoothed a little bit, less strict. And now I almost feel like they've fallen back to more of an identity problem, more of the dissonance, and it's actually reversed a little bit. Do you recognize this pattern as well?
Yes.
And can it happen to climate? That's actually the question, of course.
Yeah. What can I say about that? I would say that in the beginning, when the threat is novel, our human risk system, I write about that in my book, what we think about when we try not to think about global warming. There's quite a few things that trigger our feeling of risk, because we're not rational risk analyzers. We react to the emotional risk feelings. So if something is novel, it's new, then we get much more fear than if we'd had it for a long time. If it's spectacular, if I can see and hear ambulances and people dying and suffocating in the hospitals, and then this spectacular human news makes the risk much bigger. And also, if it is not spoken about in the media, then I will copy that, because I think it's a very dangerous thing, because other people are saying it's dangerous, and particularly if leaders are saying it. But then gradually, both the novelty and the repetition of it, and also the spectacular of it, all those things are fading away, and with that, the risk feeling will go down. And that's why what I think we're seeing now with the COVID, people are starting to shrug their shoulders. Okay, we had this for half a year now. We're gradually getting habituated to it, as I was saying, and I think I see that now. And at some point, politicians will no longer gain by being very strict. They will gain by giving people in to their soothing their identities and following that more relaxed attitude. That's my prediction, at least, for the next half year.
All right. Well,
Thanks.
yeah, I hope that answers your questions, Dr. Groeskamp. It's always very interesting to see this kind of format at a symposium. But now, Espen, thank you so much for your contribution and your part of the lecture. It was very interesting to see how we can adapt to avoid the worst. Now we'll be joined by Dr. Groeskamp, who has done research on what happens if we don't adapt early, but if we have to adapt late. So the worst case scenario, what he's most famous for, the North European Enclosure Dam, which he'll shortly tell us a little bit about, as well as more broadly from his perspective as physical oceanographer at the Netherlands Royal Institute for Sea Research. So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Groeskamp.
Thanks. While I'm sharing my screen, let's see, we should start here. I hope that Per will still be here as well, because I think some of the things that I will talk about really do fit in with a lot of the work that he's, a lot of the stuff that he talked about. So I'm Sjoerd Groeskamp, and I'm really glad that you guys invited me and gave me some space to talk about climate change and maybe how bad it can get. Let me start with a little introduction, and please let me know if the sound is not working, because we had some problems with that before.
Half Nederland onder water. En om dit rampscenario te voorkomen bedacht oceanograaf Sjoerd Groeskamp een megalomaan plan. De hele EU beschermd door 1 Noordzeedijk. En inmiddels gaat zijn plan de wereld over.
It's one of the craziest ideas for protecting our east coast from flooding.
There is a scientist across the sea there in the Netherlands who has come up with a cunning plan.
Een dijk die de volledige Noordzee afsluit, dat is het plan van, hoe kan het ook anders, een aantal Nederlanders.
I'm Dutch. Of course I think this works.
Een dijk van meer dan 600 kilometer van Frankrijk tot Noorwegen.
Huge dams, you can see them on the map there, north and south.
Een gigantisch project.
Effectively turning the North Sea into a lake. The enclosure would run 300 miles from Scotland to Norway and from southwest England to northern France.
Well, this is what we do all the time. Yeah. Yes, so this was a little introduction to show you that this idea went all through the media. And really the idea behind it for me was to show people where we could possibly get to if we don't mitigate climate change on time. But you can only do that properly when you show a real possible solution. And the thing is, this is a giant problem. Climate change is a giant problem, so it requires a giant solution. And the real solution, of course, is to mitigate climate change. So let's not get to large amounts of sea level rise, but we might get there. So even in that case, we have to think about solutions. But I'm going to give you a disclaimer that this dam idea is a symptomatic treatment of a much bigger problem. But it gives people a view like, all right, if we keep going like this, then we need to build a dam. And that's something that people understand, and therefore they can have an opinion about it. And I think Per also more or less mentioned this in his step thing. So I'm hoping that this contributes to people's awareness and hopefully willingness to mitigate climate change. So how did we get to the point that we're even thinking about these kind of huge solutions? Well, the answer is in climate change, of course. I'm going to go quickly through climate change. Most of you do know a lot about it, but I'm just going to refresh it a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the dam itself. So on this axis, you see the CO2 on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, you see the millions of years ago. And we can see that the amount of carbon we have in the atmosphere right now, about 420 parts per million. The last time that happened was about 200 million years ago. So that's a long time ago. And here you can see a zoom of the amount of carbon in the concentration, the amount of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, sorry. And this is the last 800,000 years, and you can see it wobbling around a lot. And it varies between about 180 parts per million to 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. And this 280 parts is already quite big if you look at the last almost million years ago. But look at where we are now. This is where we are today, which is a rapid increase in absolutely no time. We're at about 420 parts per million. And if we then look at what temperature is doing, we can see that temperature has varied -8 to +4 compared to the average temperature in the last couple of hundred years, which means with these tiny changes, or only 100 parts per million changes in CO2, we see many degrees changes in temperature in the world, varying with the CO2. So the big question is, if we suddenly increase that CO2 so enormously much, where is the temperature going to go? And with the temperature, what is sea level rise going to do? So this depends on scenarios of CO2 emissions. And the thing with these scenarios is that we started about 280 parts per million pre-industrial, and then we started increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the future scenario, so the amount of CO2 in 2100 could, for example, be about 420 parts per million. That's as much as it is now. And those are the most optimistic scenarios from the IPCC. And that would require us to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, because we're going to shoot over that for sure. So we don't even have the technology for that, except for, building or planting trees, basically. Then there's a couple of scenarios that are in between. And remember, 420 is already a lot. And then the worst case scenarios, which they call business as usual, but that's not the case anymore, can be almost up to 1,000 parts per million. So that's pretty doom and gloom, actually. So what does the temperature do with this? And can we avoid this kind of scenarios? So CO2 is rising, and with the CO2, the temperature rises. This will continue for a while now. And what happens to sea level rise then? Well, this is a picture of the CO2 concentrations, again, not 800,000 years ago, but up to 500,000 years ago. And in blue, we see superimposed on that the sea level rise. And look at the axis on the right-hand side for the blue. You can see that with those variations in CO2, we see about 100 meters sea level changes from in the past 500,000 years. So that's a lot. We're not talking meters, we're talking tens of meters as natural variability of the ocean's sea level. And we built our society in the last 2,000 to 5,000 years. And in that time, sea level was rather constant. So we thought that sea level was constant, at least that's how we acted. And now it's changing, and this gives a problem. So very short, the sea level has risen 20 centimeters in the last 100 years. Now that's not going to concern a lot of people, but like with the coronavirus, there is talk of exponential growth. So all the models, they predict that this will accelerate. And we've already seen that the sea level is rising twice as fast now than it did 120 years ago. And it will only go faster and faster and faster. And the most recent acceleration is due to the loss of ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. But that's the past. We really want to know what's going to happen in the future. So what about future sea level rise? So it's very hard not to be too doom and gloom, but so I'm going to go there a little bit now. The predictions for our temperature, unfortunately, are more likely to be 2 degrees in 2100 than it's going to be 1.5 degrees, or even more than 2 degrees. And overall, if you double the CO2 and we predict where we're going to be in the coming 100 years, there's a prediction of about 4 to 10 degrees global temperature rise, possibly if we don't mitigate climate change fast enough. If you add to that from models and studies, we know that sea level rise is about 2.3 meters per degree warming. You can calculate that this should lead to about 9 to 23 meters sea level rise over the next 1,000 or 2,000 years or so. We don't really know exactly. That's not what this is saying. It's just saying, giving you a total. At the same time, historical records show that there's a 68% chance to get 9 meters sea level rise if you have CO2 concentrations as we have at this moment. So those are not very good numbers, of course. And that's basically what motivated me. So from that, I conclude that, we can get 90 to 30 meters of sea level rise in the next hundreds to thousands of years. But how fast is this going to go, really? Well, in the most optimistic scenario, this has already worked from 7 years ago. In the most optimistic scenarios with the most optimistic CO2 emission patterns, we're going to stay below 1 meter. So this is possible, maybe, staying below 1 meter. I have to admit that this work is pretty much outdated because there's a really underestimation of what the ice sheets are doing, because in recent work, they found that ice sheets can become unstable and therefore accelerate their melting and then get even more sea level rise. So this 1 meter is really the very, very, very minimum we're going to get. What is the worst we're going to get in the near future? Well, if we look at the worst case CO2 emission scenarios combined with this new knowledge of these ice sheet instabilities, we're going to get to these kind of scenarios where we might be up to 2 meters in 80 years from now. So, you know, when children that are born now are 80 years, up to 15 meters in about 500 years from now. And those are really, really, really big numbers. It might not look like a whole lot, but it really is if you want to react and respond to this on time. Now, these numbers here are 4 years old and they have been contested a little bit. And we think they're slight overestimates, yet they're definitely not as an overestimate as we would like to be comfortable. So we really have to consider the fact that although we might be able to reduce climate change, we might still get on some of these worst case scenarios. So this is how, for me, in my mind, I started to think about this huge project, which is, first of all, sea level will rise at least 1 meter, but it could be over 20 meters in the next thousands of years if we're unlucky, or 30 meters. But in the next 80 to 500 years, if we're on one of those tracks where we're not doing great with climate change, we can already get 2 meters in 80 years and much more beyond that. If we're doing a bit better and we take an average of what experts think, we might actually be able to reduce it to 2 meters in a couple hundred years, and that's doable. But if we don't, and I don't know if the chance is 1% or 10%, but there is a real chance that we won't make it. And for that, we also need to start thinking about solutions, because which scenario we're going to end up on, we don't know. We're all trying very hard to get on one of those optimistic scenarios, but we don't know it at the point yet. And on top of that, there is a risk of so-called tipping points. So for example, take Greenland. The ice sheet of Greenland is several kilometers high, where it's very cold in the atmosphere. And if you start melting it from the top, it starts to become less high, and there the temperature is a little bit warmer as well, so it melts a little bit easier. And then it melts more and it gets lower and melts even easier, and that accelerates until you lost your whole Greenland ice sheet. And those are what they call tipping points, that if you put them in motion, they're irreversible. You can't undo them anymore. They will happen, and then they have to restore from scratch. And some people argue that we're already at some of those tipping points. Others argue that we haven't. We don't really know. But if we have, we're going to get a lot of sea level rise, regardless of what we do with CO2 in the next 100 years. And then there's the point of the high risk of the worst case scenario. So even if it's 1% chance that we're going to get on those bad scenarios, if you would have 1% chance that you're going to win the lottery, the jackpot, everybody would buy a ticket. But of course, I think that because even if there's 1% chance, we should think about solutions for these scenarios and mentally prepare for the fact that it could happen. Because the implementation time of any solution is basically going to be very long. For example, if you rise the dikes in the Netherlands by 1 meter now, this might help you for 50, 60 years. But then by that time, because sea level rises faster and faster, if you do another meter on top of that, you can only enjoy that for 20 years. And then, it takes maybe 30 years to prepare the next rise then you're too late. So you have to think several steps ahead of time, sometimes 100 years ahead of time, to face these problems that are on such slow and long timescales. And this is very complicated. And that line of thinking basically led to this idea of this ridiculous dams. But when I first drew this map for myself, I was like, is this even possible? And then I just started to do some back of the envelope calculations. And that's why I'm going to take you through those back of the envelope calculations. So then we can also talk a little bit about this from a policy perspective, because it is an interesting idea from a policy perspective as well. Once again, I want to say that I think the giant problems demand giant solutions, and we should therefore allow ourselves to think out of the box, not shoot people for being too crazy. Because even if we don't get to this, which I really, really hope, We might learn a lot from that for solutions that are acceptable for less sea level rise. Because these kind of things are still symptomatic treatments of a problem. We'll come back to that in a second as well. Because what are your other alternative solutions? Well, give up. This is a map of the Netherlands, I think something like 2 meters sea level rise, maybe even less. Giving up is always much more expensive, and it's very dramatic, of course, because people have to move or they'll die or whatever is going to happen, it's going to be dramatic. The only way you can make this work, not so dramatically, is if you implement managed migration. So basically over hundreds of years, maybe 100 years, you try and move people away from the coast by building cities elsewhere, by building economical centers elsewhere. But you will lose cultural heritage and people don't like to move. So this takes a lot of time and it requires politicians to start this now. And we don't really see this. So it's doubtable if this is going to be a solution or not. Which in that case, you're left with protection. Let's just protect the cities. Let's just try and protect them. And if that's your choice, then you could either protect all the coast, you know, the Dutch coast in this map, and the Danish coast, and the German coast, and the English coast, or you can all work together and build something like this, and then protect all this coast, and you don't have to build thousands of kilometers of dikes, but only the ones that are shown here. Is this a crazy idea? Well, that's up to you to judge. But if you're in the Netherlands and you need to protect yourself and you just want to surround yourself with a dike, you will ultimately have to talk with Germany and Belgium too, and they will have to talk with France and Denmark in order for the water not to get through the sides, for example. So we will need to collaborate on large scales anyway. And this way, you protect about 25 million people on their current population density if the water would rise about 2 meters. So let's just think about if this is even possible. Let's start with the size. The Afsluitdijk is the second longest dike at the moment, and there's now a new one in South Korea, which is 1 kilometer longer, but it's also a little bit deeper, up to 54 meters. It's wider, etc. But still, if you take the volume of that one, it would be about 100 times smaller than the one we just looked at on the map. So the scales of the things that we suggested in that paper are ridiculous. It's 100 times bigger than anything out there. So can we even pay for that? Well, if we look at what the other dikes cost and what the Maasvlakte 2 with all the infrastructure cost, if we know what dams in general cost, if we extrapolate all those estimates and we do back of the envelope calculations, we take into account some other stuff, we came to an upper limit of about 550 billion euros. And I dare to say that even, you know, these projects have a nasty habit of becoming much more expensive than you initially thought. Even if it would be twice as expensive, I would still say it's very cheap. First of all, compared to the amount of stuff you protect, but also if you look at the economic power, the GDP of those countries, or even of just the UK, Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium, they can bear this. They can definitely bear this. So financially, it is not a problem. And just to put it in perspective, if sea level would rise 1.5 meters in 2100, which might be possible in the worst case scenarios, and you would integrate the cost for the Netherlands over the next 80 years, which will increase enormously very rapidly in this scenario, you already get to about 1/3 of the cost of this dam, just trying to protect the Netherlands. And that's only for 80 years. We're not talking about the centuries after that, and it's just for the Netherlands. So in other words, financially, this dam would really be a solution. This is a pattern of the depths. So here you can see the total depth up to 320 meters. And on the x-axis, you see sort of the distance of these different sections of the dam. And the main thing to look at is all the way at the right near Norway, near Bergen, where it can be up to 300 meters depth. And that could be a challenge, you know, a technical challenge on how you're going to build a dam at 300 meters depth. Well, I talked to a lot of engineers by now that responded on this, and none of them think it's not possible. For example, we have oil rigs like this ones that are mounted at the bottom. They're fixed to the bottom. That is about 500 meters depth. Now, a dam is definitely not the same as an oil rig, but all the technical experts, they all think it's possible as far as I know. So I don't think technologically it's a challenge, but it's possible. Then there's a minor detail that the rivers would still push water, fresh water, into the basin that is now close from the Atlantic. And if we don't pump that out, the sea level would still rise about 1 meter a year in that basin, and that's not very helpful. So you need to pump that out, of course. And you need about 100 pumps of the size that are now at the Afsluitdijk. So that's a lot, of course, it will cost a lot, but it is definitely doable. We looked at that as well. Then there's the problem with harbors. Some of the biggest harbors are inside the basin now. And what are you going to do with them? Well, you could build new harbors on the outside, work with trains and ships on the inside, transfer goods, etc. And you can wonder if that's helpful. Well, the thing is, if we're talking about 2, 3, 4 meters sea level rise, because those are the numbers that you need to get to for this dam to be, a possible solution, then these harbors, the Rotterdam harbor with 4 or 3 meters sea level rise, try to imagine all the things that have to adapt for that to work. And that's the same for all the other harbors there. So that's going to cost a lot of money anyway. So if we're going to get to sea level rise of these numbers, then the harbors are going to be in trouble anyway, and we have to come with solutions. And the same is for the sand. To build this dike, you would need about a year worth of sand that they use in construction in the world. That's a lot, and sand is getting scarce, which means that's going to be a problem. But just imagine replacing all the cities or trying to build thousands of kilometers of dikes along the coasts. You run into similar problems. So a lot of those details still have to be done, but the thing is, the alternatives, if we get to more than 2, 3 meters sea level rise, is never good. There's no good solution left, only least worst solutions. Then, for example, terrorism is a thing. What if they blow a hole in the dike? Well, actually, that would be a problem, but it might not be as big of a problem if you think, because if you make a little hole in this dike, you would first have to fill up the whole North Sea and the Baltic Sea. And that fills very slowly because it's a huge area. Whereas if you, and that could give you, if you do quick calculations, that can give you weeks or even months to fix the problem. Whereas if you build a dike on the coast and they build it up, they could blow up the Afsluitdijk any moment, for example, then cities will start flooding within minutes or hours. So this would actually give you a bit of a buffer for those kind of things. Arguably could be done. So my conclusion when we started writing this paper or doing initial calculations was, damn, this can actually be done. And that's very concerning. Because if it can be done, then at some point we might get to these solutions, and we really don't want that. And that's the second point. Should we now sit back and relax? No, absolutely not. Because there's lots of impacts. For example, the tides will disappear in the basin. Tidal mixing will have to happen somewhere else, and that can change ecosystem. Inside the basin, it will become fresh. It will completely change all the biology and make it collapse and replace with something else, look much more like the Baltic Sea, for example, possibly. So that's a destruction of nature on a scale that we don't want. But if people at some point have to choose between moving out of their house or maybe turning this into a lake, then I'm afraid they'll choose to turn this into a lake. And that's why this, for me, is a call to mitigate climate change. Otherwise, we have to deal with these kind of things. Then there's the politics, and this is something that you guys might be, more experts in. There's good sides and bad sides of this. Good sides is that if you build thousands of kilometers of coast, or if you have to move for a lot of people, people don't like that. Politicians don't like to do that. Whereas this need thing, it will be mostly built into the sea, where you don't have to move people around, and politicians might actually like that more. On the other hand, this requires, a collaborative and proactive approach over many generations, many political parties, all of Europe at least. That's huge collaboration, and I'm not sure if they can pull it off. But having that said, anything to do with climate change really requires that kind of collaboration. So that's something it's very hard to predict, and I would love to study that more. But I'm a physical oceanographer, so that's not my job. The point I want to make as well is that sea level rise is just one consequence of climate change. And there are many other consequences, like food shortages or water shortages or bushfires, and all these kind of things can lead to migration. Migration can lead to political and social tensions and wars. And don't forget, we, the Dutch people, we think we're all happy and nice here, but we can become those climate refugees if we don't watch out with sea level rise and these kind of things. We could all be moving to Germany, and I don't think the Germans would like that. So this is not something for the people in Africa, like a lot of people often think. Like, climate refugees are already happening, and we could become one of them if we don't stop climate change. So what I'm proposing here is just one solution for a tiny bit of the world for one problem of climate change. The real solution is to fight climate change. And I hope that showing this kind of solution and to see that even for one such aspect, you already need to go through all this length and all this effort. I hope that people get more motivated to do something about climate change. And there's people that do this. Like, I really believe now that we have to not just reduce emissions, but we have to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. And there's groups like climatecleanup.org. I would motivate you to look at them up. That really try and look like which groups, which people around the world are trying to get CO2 out of the atmosphere and how can we support them. It's very good kind of work. Unfortunately, from the government point of view, I don't think there's enough money available to do this kind of research. So how can we avoid it? Well, the politics, they will have to act on time. This is a big problem, I think, and I'd love to hear your opinions about it, especially because they might have to, implement unpopular policies to fight climate change. And they need to treat it like Corona. They need to treat it as an emergency now, not an emergency in 100 years from now. No, we're already in code red, so to speak, for climate. So we have to act now. And as individuals, we need to make that happen as well. We need to be willing to make the sacrifices and vote for the right politicians that are going to put in policy that we don't like, but we'll have to, sacrifice in order to, eat less meat or use the cars less or different cars or whatever it's going to be. It's going to probably hit us in a wallet or something. And we need to be willing to make those sacrifices if need be. Hopefully, there are smart people out there that help us make these sacrifices minimal so more people can live with it. But that's something we need to do. And one thing, and I heard Per talk about this as well, don't listen to what you want to hear, but listen to what you need to hear. And this is, of course, I find this very difficult, and especially to see what's happening in the world right now. There's a lot of misinformation going around and people don't trust science anymore. I've heard people say, I don't believe in facts, those kind of things. And that's a bad sign. We really need to accept things for what they are and not try and get around it. So for me, this is what's happening. We have a side that is evil. It's easy to pick them out, right? There are certain companies out there that are really doing evil, that they're leading misinformation for their own gain. There's people like Trump and Bolsonaro about that I consider evil if it comes to climate change and these kind of things. But even you all have your crazy uncle maybe that doesn't want to believe anything, or maybe yourself. I often have the feeling I'm not doing enough, and I think that's why I love this presentation so much. But then there's the good people. Who is the good people? It's actually not that hard to. Is it the European Union? Is it now China because they're going to be carbon neutral in 2060? Are they now the good guys, or is it Greenpeace? Or the scientists that are trying to raise everybody's attention, or maybe Leonardo DiCaprio? I saw him pass by today. So it's actually not that easy to pick out who are the good ones, while it's very easy to pick out who are the bad ones. And I think this is part of the problem sometimes. So for me, most importantly, this whole thing with this dam that got so much attention, I think because it can visualize all these complex numbers. 2 degrees warming, what does that mean? Well, it means we have to build a dike like this. Oh, wow. Oh, no, that's not good. Now I have an opinion. It engages people in the conversation. So I think that's why it got so much attention. But I do believe that if we act now, we can still avoid problems of solutions of this size. And if we don't act now, then this warning, this paper that we put out as a warning might actually become a solution. And I sincerely hope that we're not going to get there. And that's the main message I wanted to give today. And I hope you guys have some nice things to add to it. Thank you for giving me this stage.
Yeah, thank you kindly for your lecture. It was very, very comprehensive overview. I'd already briefly skimmed through your paper and read a couple bits of it, but this is far better to just fully understand it. What I'm going to say is, if you're in the audience and if you have any questions, please raise your hand now. And in the order that the hands are raised, I'll get around to your questions. Until that time, so like I'll just ask my own question, and while that question's being answered, feel free to raise your hands and ask away. Or actually, there's already one in the from our Commissioner of Internal Affairs, which is asking about the UK and Ireland. Linda is half Dutch, half English, and so she's concerned about, well, the British Isles. What would happen to the unprotected parts of the world?
Was that a question, or I'm going to hear the question now?
What happens with Ireland? What happens with the parts which aren't protected?
Yes, so I get this question a lot about leaving out Ireland. We didn't calculate Ireland. Let me see. I can quickly share my screen again. Do you see this?
Yep.
So we did have a picture in the paper where we suggested some other locations in the world where you could possibly do something like this. And there we did include Ireland here, for example. But we didn't get to calculate those things. So we also had this version here where we talk about the Japanese Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea. So I can say, yes, there could be a solution. Calculations haven't been done if it might be worth it, doable, what the depths are, etc. So I can't really say myself if that's possible or not. But we did suggest it as a possible thing that it's a location where it might work, because we looked into it a little bit, but didn't do the details.
All right. Well, seeing as there's still no more questions from the crowd, I do have a somewhat related question as well, which is like about the ethics of this kind of dam project. So let's say assume it's gone that bad, we have to protect our coasts. If, let's say, Europe built this dam, and also let's say one in the Mediterranean makes Fortress Europe against climate change, against rising sea levels, how does this put it in terms of, the rest of the world? Is this the end of globalization? Is this would blocking off and stopping sea level rise in the Baltic Sea and the Northern Sea increase sea level rise drastically elsewhere? Is this just a negligible amount?
There's a couple of answers to that question. It won't rise sea level. If we talk about 2, 3, 4 meters sea level rise, say more than 2 meters, then this becomes of interest. Then the effect of including the Baltic and the North Sea on the globe with the rest of the ocean is not going to be that big for the sea level rise in the rest of the world. It's order centimeters, maybe, while we're talking about meters already globally. So that's not going to be too bad. But this is there's a few things. This is, as far as you can call it a solution, it's a solution for just one place in the world. But I'm not sure what you guys think, but if you would, let's say this whole the whole European coast is worried about sea level rise, and they're spending lots of money, way more than this projected for this project. They're concerned with it, spending a lot of money on it, and that's their focus. Then they're not doing a lot of economical trade worldwide, not with Austria that doesn't have a coast. But if the Netherlands and Germany are just focused on, trying to disaster relief and those kind of things, they're not going to do a lot of trade probably. So even in the world economics, I think it benefits from these countries not having to worry too much about this. Now, whether then this is the best solution or another version, I don't know. I think in the end, the best solution is to avoid climate change. But if we don't get there, then this is more than just a solution for those few people, 25 million, who would otherwise maybe drown or have to move. It's much bigger than that, I think. And I think that's just a metaphor for how big the problem of climate change can be if we don't address it, basically.
All right. Yeah, that's a fair approach to it, I believe. All right, Anna, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes. Thank you very much for the lecture. I was wondering, because I had Googled before on the Northern European Enclosure Dam, how many years would you expect that to take to build? And also, do you think it's possible to have enough sustained international cooperation for such a long time for building a dam? Or is there a risk that countries pull out? And how can you assure this?
I don't know. So the estimates of how long it takes to build this, I think it depends on if you actually think of the building itself, or if you include the whole trajectory before that, where you have to convince all the politicians to get all that stuff going. That's more when it comes into policy, and I think when you guys are the experts. But the estimates now have been 50 to 100 years, which is potentially on the same scale as, for example, managed migration, which is could work, moving whole cities, but you have to do that on time as well. It's questionable if people like that. So whatever the solution is going to be, it's going to take long, and so that's the problem with you need multiple generations, multiple parties, multiple countries to be aligned continuously. I don't know if that's possible, but if that's not possible, then fighting climate change, I think in general, might be a bit of a problem. So we need something like that to happen. And so we started with the Technical University of Delft. We started to host this problem as a thing you could do as a master's student, and not just look at the technical details, but also look at the policy problems, or the fact that it's built in international waters. What are the social impacts and the economical impacts, all these kind of things, and how do you get this policy through a European Parliament or something? Those are questions that still need to be answered. If you can answer it for this, you probably learn so much that if sea level rise doesn't get that bad, you probably still solved a lot of problems and thought about a lot of problems for other policies that require large collaborations. So we think it's a nice starting point for thinking about larger scale solutions and the kind of direction we need to go in, whether it's for this dam or whether it's for a bigger approach to avoid climate change. You will need to get to this kind of thing, like the Paris Agreement is trying to do in a way. And you see that countries pull out of that. So it's a tough question.
Collaboration is key, I guess. If you don't work together, you can't beat the problem.
Yeah, climate change doesn't see boundaries. It doesn't see country borders or anything like that. You see rain patterns shifting country. Suddenly, where it didn't rain, it now rains. But there's no infrastructure to do farming. But the people that were doing farming here, they can't move there because it's a different country, and you get all these tensions, and that's because we made up these borders. But climate change doesn't care about that. So it really requires a collaborative approach.
Fair. Yeah, I fully agree. Absolutely. Is there any questions from the audience? If you have anything, again, please go to the participants button and just raise your hand. If not, I do have another question. And seeing as people don't have too many questions, I think we might end it after this one, unless another pops up. So about 60 million years ago, you had the Eocene thermal maximum. Essentially, the entire world was covered in water, not ice. There was hardly any, like the global weather patterns were just set to level to global temperature, which was far higher than it is now. Antarctica was green. The Arctic was also green, with all these life in the polar waters. To what extent is this dam actually really necessary? Let's say we can just adapt to a new normal as humans. I mean, humans have proven in our history that we are immensely adaptive. Sure, we've got conflict. Sure, we've got migration, politics, etc. In the grand scheme of things, it's worked out so far through some pretty big changes already compared to like 13,000 years ago when you had the Green Sahara. So is this dam truly necessary beyond the economic scope and beyond our current wanting to maintain the current state of affairs? Can't we also just adopt a laissez-faire approach and just say what comes, we'll adapt to a new normal?
Well, the way I see it, Earth doesn't care. we had dinosaurs and now we don't. The Earth will keep spinning. We can have humans and we maybe later we don't. I don't know. So it's almost a moral question, I think. We made a society, and this society has grown a lot in the last 2,000-3,000 years. And because of that, we based the way we live and where we live, where we build, where we do our agriculture, where we have our ports and all these kind of things, on the climate of the last, say, 1,000 years, mostly 2,000 years, with the associated sea level. Well, for the climate of the Earth, that is an instant moment. It's like a second of the day. Not much has changed. Now we are completely raveling up that balance and allowing the Earth to change much faster than we as a society can, adapt. So the question is, yes, of course, human race might survive and all these kind of things, but do we want to do it in a nice way, or do we want to let all of the people suffer and die? And I think that's what you got to wonder yourself. What are you going to leave for the next generation? Earth doesn't really care, I think. There has been mass extinctions before, it will probably happen again. So this is almost more of a moral question, and I think it's worth trying to, I don't necessarily think we should keep Earth as it is right now. We should allow it to change and stuff, but we don't have to, kill all the animals necessarily if we can avoid it, and especially not ourselves either. So it's a very difficult question to answer. My personal view is, let's just try to make the best of it and not have everybody suffer and die, because it could be you. Do you think it's worth it for you or your children not to have to move in 50 years or 80 years from now because sea level is rising? That's the kind of question you got to wonder. If your answer to that is yes, then I think it's worth fighting for it. And
yeah, absolutely.
I think it's as simple as that, really, because
for people also putting it in terms of yourself is always the ultimate way of seeing, okay, would this affect me? And yeah, although there's certain points in there which I'd be questionable about. All right. Are you up for answering one more question from?
I'm here now,
Treasure?
So I'm good.
All right.
In
that case, Treasurer and President. I'm not sure which one of you wants to ask a question.
Yes, me actually. So first of all, thank you so much for this very interesting topic talk. I was just wondering, and perhaps it's not necessarily your area of expertise, but how likely do you think this scenario is that this is going to have to happen?
It is a very good question. There are projections that have chances in there. There's so much chance. You get a mean sea level rise for this amount of CO2, and there's a 67% chance it's going to be between this and this range, etc., etc. But those ranges, those chances depend on the quality of your numerical model, which has all kinds of physics in there that we can't solve, and there's lots of processes that are very complicated to predict in the future, and think of all the weather patterns and stuff like this. It's very hard to numerically compute this. So there's a lot of uncertainties, even in predicting that one line, which has its own uncertainty. So it's a very difficult question to answer. But what I do think seems to be the tendency of what I hear colleagues say and everything is that there's definitely a non-zero chance, probably in order percentage, I would guess, that we could get on one of the bad tracks. In fact, only until recently, we were still on the worst case track. Only recently, it started to go a little bit off the worst case scenarios. So I think we can do it as humans. We can get CO2 out of the atmosphere, all these kind of things. We're starting to do that now slowly. So there's definitely a chance that we can make it. We can stay on those optimistic tracks, or get on there, to be more exact. But then there's the points of the tipping points, for example. And those tipping points, we don't know enough about them because it's very complicated, nonlinear dynamics, and it's just very difficult to say if we already reached one. Some people really think we did, others think we didn't. So ultimately, I think there's definitely a higher chance to get on one of the worst case scenarios than it is to win the lottery. And we still buy tickets for the lottery. So I think we should definitely think about the worst case scenarios, prepare ourselves mentally, and fight for the most optimistic scenarios. That's my approach.
Taking Per Espen's advice on this matter, trying to do our best to avoid it, but preparing for the worst.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Or also prepare for the worst.
Also, of course.
Because some of the people that had most, were most shocked about it and against this, were often biologists and ecosystem people, and because they thought of the ecosystem in the near future, or they had scenarios for the future of the Netherlands, but that consists of 1 meter sea level rise, maybe 2 meters at most. If we really get on those worst case scenarios, then, or even somewhere halfway, then it could be much worse than 1 or 2 meters. So the scenarios that they thought of, which are beautiful and would be awesome if we can limit climate change, then it will be beautiful. But if we don't limit it, then they're a little useless, so to speak. So we just have to think of the whole range. It's just, and allow ourselves to do so, because I had a lot of colleagues that were, they didn't dare to say these things, basically. It was too out of the box, and they were afraid that they would lose face, basically. And now that it's out there, it allows ourselves and many other people to think bigger and think more out of the box, and hopefully be prepared for the worst case scenario. And I think it also helps for people to visualize what the worst case scenario is, and then give them hopefully an incentive to avoid it. So, because I don't want this, I really don't want this, even though we published it, it doesn't mean that we want it, right? It's just to show you what could happen.
Yeah, raising awareness for what could happen is a good way to get people to take action as well. With that, I think we'll thank you kindly for your lecture and for answering the questions so far beyond the ending deadline. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was really good to hear your thoughts on these matters.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then hopefully, maybe, possibly, we can organize something in person when all this COVID situation ends. And with that, I'd like to end this symposium on climate adaptation. Feel free to stick around still to, talk about it afterwards if you've got any burning topics you'd like to raise or issues which you haven't answered. Otherwise, it's maybe show up on Thursday when we have our panel discussion on the future of the United Nations, where certain experts will also go into whether we can come together with the rest of the world to solve climate change, among other topics. And possibly next week with, one of the questions from Linda, will be joined by the ambassador of Ireland. If you want, you could also ask him what he thinks of the NEED and what would happen if Ireland isn't under part of that dam project. And yeah, with that, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Groeskamp, for giving the lecture. And hopefully we'll see you around at coming SIB events.